you're watching this video, it's probably because you have the service fuel system light in your C6 Corvette. And I have a heavily modified C6 Corvette. And that matters to you because during my modifications, I found a loophole in the factory computer that allows you to delete sensor B completely from the factory computer, and it will still work like it did from the factory. Your fuel gauge will work, your range will work, everything will work. So in this video, I'm going to give you an in-depth technical description of how the fuel system works so that you understand what's going on, which tables to modify, and I'll give you some information about how I've modified my fuel system, and maybe you want to do the same thing to make it easier to work on whenever you do the modifications to your car. So let's get started. So let's get started talking about the fuel system modifications to eliminate sensor B, which on the screen would be the right sensor. In your car, that's the passenger side sensor. So what you have on the screen here is the fuel tanks actually taken out of a Corvette C6. The silver tube that runs between the two is the crossover tube. And because that thing is really difficult to get in and out of the vehicle, and there's all kinds of tubes that actually run inside of that and link things together, I decided to eliminate all of that and connect the two tanks at the base of the tank, which is what necessitated me to remove or delete the sensor B, or the passenger side sensor, from the tank, or from the in-tank sensing, and use everything for sensor A. One of the things you have to keep in mind here is that there's actually two separate sensors that the computer uses to measure the volume inside of each of the tanks. So here's how my fuel system modification actually looks inside the car. I have a tube that crosses over between the two that actually hangs beneath the two tanks, and I connect the two tanks at the base of the tanks, whereas from the factory it's connected at the top of the tanks. This allows me to only have to use one sensor, and it makes getting these things in and out so much easier, because in a modified car, that's just something you're going to have to deal with on the regular basis, is taking things apart and putting them back together. So if you're just here to see what the sensor B delete looks like, this isn't something that you're going to have to worry about. Something I do want to point out is all of the information that I'm going to share with you throughout the course of this video is my own testing that I actually did with my own computer. I used a software, HPTuners, and I used some of the VCM scanner tools so that I could actually take all of these measurements and do all the empirical testing myself. So you can see here on the screen, you can actually display the voltage reading of each sensor independently. You can also display the hard-coded values that the system has written into the computer, and you can kind of play around with this on your own, and that's what I did, and that's how I got all of my information that I'm about to share with you guys. So this is what the C6 fuel tanks look like. It's kind of like a triangular trapezoidal thing. It has a fuel basket that hangs inside of the tank. That fuel basket has an arm attached to it that has a little float bob on it, just like a toilet bowl. That float bob can only reach so far down in the tank. And in my testing, at the base level where that float bob is sitting on the bottom of the tank, it reads 0.6 volts. That's the minimum reading. The maximum reading is 2.4 volts. Now that's the absolute maximum it can read because of the shape of the tank. Even though the sensor has a wider range than that, it can only measure that because of the physical constraints of the tank. The other thing you have to keep in mind is that there's quite a bit of unmeasured capacity in the fuel tanks, and that actually gets ignored by the computers, and it defaults to a hard-coded value until a certain point, and that's something I'll go over in just a minute. Another critical detail that you have to keep in mind of how the factory system works for the fuel system is it treats the tanks individually and then sums them together for all of the calculations and for the gauge to display everything. So you have to imagine two separate devices taking two separate measurements, and that's how everything works in the computer, because in reality they are two separate tanks. Even though they are connected, they are acting independent of each other. So for the purposes of this discussion, sensor A is located inside of the driver's side fuel tank. Sensor B is located inside of the passenger side fuel tank. You only have to have sensor A to make everything work. It's known as the primary sensor in the computer, and the passenger side tank, aka sensor B, is known as the secondary sensor. So you can completely turn off the secondary sensor and the computer will work just fine. Another thing worth noting here is that because of the shape of the tanks, the sensors won't actually read 2.54 volts. That's what the maximum reading is capable of on these sensors, but it won't actually read that because the sensor arm will actually bump into the side of the tank. So what the computer does is it has a voltage adder, so it adds the voltage from tank A and tank B, and that's how you get a sum to your 5-volt reference. So keep that in mind also as we walk through this stuff. So these are the actual tables inside of the factory computer that impact both the gauge display and the inputs to the computer for things like range to E and those kind of things. You can see here on the screen, I've actually got some zeroed out values for the secondary volume. We're going to cover this here in a minute, but you have to keep in mind that the sensor is reading a voltage. That gets converted to a percentage, and then that's what you see in the table. So to get the percentage value, you have to take 5 volts as 100%. You have to divide that so that you have half of that voltage. Then you have to take the percentage of that, and that's how you get the percentage on the table. Even more annoying than that is the percentage for the gauge is different than the percentage for the volume, which is really annoying. They're at different points. You can see the top level of the tables is actually different for the volume and different for the gauge. So that's something else that you have to play with and consider when you're doing this kind of a modification. So during my testing, I actually found that the C6 Corvette has 3 separate modes that the fueling system triggers inside of the factory computer. We'll call these mode 1, 2, and 3. So mode 1 is when the sensor is reading the absolute maximum value that it can read. And again, it's sensor A plus sensor B. And when it's in this mode, it's actually using hard-coded values from the computer, and it's ignoring the sensors. It only pulls the sensors every few minutes. I can't remember exactly what it was, but it's not very often, something like 5 minutes. It only pulls those sensors every few minutes to see if the volume has dropped. That's mode 1, and I call it full tank mode because it's only in this mode whenever you're at an absolute full tank. Mode 2 is when you're at some point less than 2.4 volts and you're above 0.73 volts. That's where you spend the majority of your time driving around when you're less than full tank but greater than E. And again, it's sensor A plus sensor B. Now it's using a combination of a measured value in that table I just showed you, and then it's using those tables to display the gauge in the car and use the volumes for all the calculations that the computer does. Mode 3 is your low fuel mode, and this is where you get the notification on your screen in the car that says check gauges, low fuel, low, and all those kind of things. When the sensor A drops below 0.73 volts, that's when it triggers this mode. When it triggers this mode, the gauge goes to 0, no matter what you have hard-coded in the table, and then it uses the volume for all the other calculations and all the other behavior that the computer uses. But once you trigger mode 3, aka low fuel mode, it ignores the gauge values that you have in the computer, and it just drops straight to E. So let's talk a little bit about mode 1, aka full tank mode. That is when the sensor in either tank is at 2.4 volts. So as long as both sensors are above this, it will go into full tank mode. Now, in mode 1, it's only triggered if low fuel mode is engaged and then the tank is filled up. So you have to trigger low fuel mode and then fill up the tank to get the sensors above 2.4 before it goes back into this full tank mode where it ignores the sensors and it uses hard-coded values. Now, the tanks have to be at full capacity and they have to be reading maximum voltage. The The fuel level sensor is ignored, and it displays the values that are hard-coded for the fuel gauge. The fuel gauge shows the default capacities of both sensors added together. So you'll notice there's actually more than one table. It's because there's more than one gauge, and it actually adds those together to get the total of the gauge displayed in the car. And that's important here in just a minute. Now, when sensor B is not functional, you have to deal with half-tank readings. So basically what happens is this sort of scenario right here. From the factory, even if you turn off sensor B, what it's going to do is ignore sensor B, but it's only going to display the values from sensor A. And no matter what you do in full tank mode, it's going to ignore tank 2 or sensor 2 unless you change the values in the computer. And I played with this tons and tons and tons to try to figure out a way around this. But what happens is when you go from mode 3, which is low fuel mode, then you fill it back up and it goes into full tank mode, it always reads just above half a tank unless you mess with the values inside of the factory computer. Now mode 2 is whenever the fuel level sensor drops below 2.4 volts, something like 2.35 or something like that. Once it drops below this below the 2.4 volt threshold, and the system pulls that sensor again and it sees this reading, now you're in mode 2 or like half tank mode. You have to remember it takes a while to burn through this unmeasured fuel capacity before you actually enter this mode. Now in mode 2, it goes from full tank mode to half tank mode or mode 2. The tank's fuel level is somewhere between the sensor maximum and the sensor minimum. And the fuel level sensor is constantly measured. It's an instantaneous measurement. Anytime you change the level of fuel gauge, it automatically reflects on the gauge inside the car. But in full tank mode, you can change that sensor around constantly, and it only populates the gauge inside the car every so often, like every 5 minutes. The fuel gauge shows the gauge values from the tune that correlate to the volume entered in the gauge capacity table. So those tables I showed you earlier, it's kind of defaulting to those values. So once it measures a certain percentage of voltage, it uses the table to give you the volume. Now when sensor B is not functional, the gauge will begin to read from sensor A as soon as sensor A reading changes from the maximum sensor. So that's whenever you have sensor B zeroed out and turned off in the computer. And again, what will happen if you don't change the factory values is you'll go from when you're in full tank mode, it'll read half tank until it starts measuring the sensors. And then once it starts measuring the sensor, it will jump up to whatever sensor A is reading unless you change some of the values. So if we go into mode 3 now, or low fuel mode, the sensor is actually reading below 0.73 volts, and then that triggers low fuel mode in your factory computer. Now in low fuel mode, what happens is the driver's tank sensor reads below 0.73 volts, it triggers low fuel mode, the gauge drops down to nothing, then you get the low fuel light, and then it uses values in the computer to make calculations on distance to empty and all those kind of things. The low fuel light's triggered, the gauge drops to E. When sensor B is not functional, if the driver's side level drops below the passenger side level, the computer automatically enters this mode. It drops to low fuel mode, you get a warning on your dash, and then the MILS light is triggered, aka service fuel system or check engine light. And this is what you'll see on your gauge in the car. You'll see it drop down to E. Now when sensor A and sensor B are functioning properly, then this isn't really an issue. But if you're not using sensor B, because you can't, like in my situation, both tank levels drop at the same time because I'm pulling from both tanks at the same time because they're connected, that's why this is important. Because in that scenario, sensor A is going to read odd for what the computer thinks. So what the computer thinks is you need sensor B, the passenger drive, to be E, then sensor A should be E. But whenever you're measuring both at the same time, the levels drop simultaneously and the computer thinks something's wrong. That's why this modification to the factory computer is necessary. So I want to go over a few examples of what you're going to see in real life to figure out exactly how this is meaningful. So let's say, for instance, you're in mode 3 or low fuel mode. Your low fuel light's been triggered. You go to the gas station, you fill up. Now you're in mode 1, aka full tank mode. You'll continue to drive and drive and drive. You'll drop into mode 2 where it continuously measures the sensor. And then if you keep driving and you go below the sensor reading of 0.73 volts, it'll trigger mode 3 again. Everything will be just like normal. Now let's say you're driving around in mode 2 or half tank mode and you fill up. You'll stay in mode 2. If you keep driving around and trigger the low fuel mode, then you'll drop into mode 3. Everything's normal there. However, if you're in mode 2 at 3/4 of a tank and then you go fill up, you stay in mode 2. You never go to mode 3 until your sensors read less than 0.73 volts. Then you go into mode 3. Now mode 1, this is the critical thing to keep in mind. Mode 1 is only ever entered after mode 3 has been entered. Otherwise, you never go into that mode. Now if you have a malfunctioning sensor B and you have MILS 3 or the MILS enabled, the service light, mode 3 gets triggered when sensor A is less than sensor B. That's why you have to turn off the MILS light and you have to modify the tables in the computer to ignore sensor B. Now malfunctioning sensor B and MILS off, you go into mode 1, 2, 3 and 1, 2 and 3 as normal, only using sensor A. It completely ignores sensor B. You note that the gauge will never read full and it will show half gauge until sensor A moves unless mode 3 is never entered. So let's say you turn the MILS light off for sensor B, but you didn't modify the factory tables. What will happen is you'll fill it up, drive around. When you fill up, it'll only read half on the gauge in the car. Then whenever you drop a little bit below where you get below that 2.4 volt threshold, then it will start reading constantly, and then it will go all the way up to almost full tank. And as long as you never trigger mode 3, as long as you never trigger mode 3 or the low fuel mode, it will always continuously measure. So if you go down to like a 1/4 tank, then fill up, go down to 1/4 tank and fill up, it'll never trigger mode 3 or that low fuel mode, and you'll never have to deal with that weird half tank. But if you modify the tables and you turn the MILS light off, then everything works as normal. So in my particular application, in my computer, you can see the factory settings on the left and my modified settings on the right. When I modified my settings this way, that allowed me to use only sensor A so that I could turn off sensor B and ignore it without triggering all these weird lights and stuff with the computer. So take a second, pause it, write these down, take a screen grab, whatever you need to do, and then we can move on. Now, one of the things that you have to keep in mind is that when we go into the factory tables for the fuel system, you have to zero out the secondary gauge except the 50% area. You have to zero out the secondary volumes. And then you have to note that the values less than 14.5% are the remaining fuel in the tank when the sensor A is at the minimum reading. So even whenever your sensor is sitting on the bottom of the tank, there's still some fuel swishing around in there. And there's usually about a gallon or so in my measurements. Sometimes a little bit more than that, depending on how you have your fuel system set up. And so what the computer does is it uses the 14.5% and below to calculate how much range you have left and all that kind of stuff. But it's only using the hard-coded volume measurements. It's ignoring the gauge measurements. So this is actually how I have my computer set up right now, and I drive it like this every day, and it works flawlessly. So above 50% on the volume, I have it set to 8 gallons. So what it does is it actually adds 8 gallons to the table above it, the primary. So then I get full gauge reading in mode 1, full tank mode on my gauge. And then the volumes are actually zeroed out everywhere except that 50%, because what happens is the sensors get added together. So if I have 0 in here, it's basically taking 7.3 gallons and adding 0, so then it's not throwing everything off. So if you modify your system this way, you can theoretically have a malfunctioning sensor B plug into the OBD2 port, modify these 4 tables and modify the previous settings in the computer that I just showed you, and you won't have to turn a single wrench, and everything will work just like it did from the factory. So that's how to modify your factory fuel system in a C6 Corvette to ignore sensor B in the case where you've modified your fuel system, or you have a malfunctioning sensor B that you just want to ignore and you don't want to pay all the money to get it fixed. So if you have HPTuners, a laptop, and this video, you can fix it yourself. So a lot of people already have modified cars, a lot of people already have a tuning software or whatever. You can do this basically in about 10 minutes in your car for free if you've already got the stuff, or you can buy HPTuners, download the software, and you'll be able to do it that way. And that's still cheaper than paying the factory, the dealership, to do this modification for you or to fix the sensor B issue, and it will work flawlessly with no issues.